my countrymen and my friends, tonight my single duty is to speak to the whole of America. Until 4:30 o'clock this morning, I had hoped against hope that some miracle would prevent a devastating war in Europe and bring to an end the invasion of Poland by Germany. For 4 long years, a succession of actual wars and constant crises have shaken the entire world and have threatened in each case to bring on the gigantic conflict which is today, unhappily, a fact.
The audio you just heard, as many of you likely guessed already, is from President Franklin Roosevelt in one of his fireside chats, in which he informs the American public of the harsh fact that war has officially broken out in Europe. In this address, Roosevelt references years of conflict that have led to this disaster. And while he doesn't list them by name, a lot of you will recognize this as a reference to the events we discussed in our classes earlier this week, like Germany's invasion of Austria and claim of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and Japan's fall to militarization and attacks on Manchuria and China. And for my classes that haven't reached these subjects yet, this serves as a haunting piece of foreshadowing for those events, which we will discuss in the upcoming days. For our class today, I want us to take a look at the United States' response to the start of World War II using a unique perspective, our president's own words and opinions on the matter. I think we take for granted how accessible our president and his ideas are today, but this wasn't always the case. Imagine the fear and uncertainty that a lot of people were going through as a Second World War broke out, and then imagine how reassuring it might have been as those same people turn on their radios to hear their president validate and confront those concerns, promising that the U.S. government is going to do something to solve this problem and to bring comfort back to its people. That's what we're going to talk about today as we take a look at Roosevelt, his fireside chats, and some of the other ideas that he had concerning the start of World War II and whether or not the United States would get involved. We'll do a little discussion on it, and I'll definitely talk about it with you tomorrow when I see you in person again. I miss you guys. I wish I was with you today in person, but I'm with the 9th graders. I'm sure we're having a great time on the field trip, but I look forward to seeing you again in class tomorrow. All right, let's get started. So real quick, as we get started today, I want to give us a brief reminder of where we're at in class. We've been talking about totalitarianism and the rise of dictators in Europe, and totalitarianism as a political idea. We talked about the qualities of a totalitarian state. We discussed some of the countries that were taking on this idea, and we talked about some of those world leaders as well. Guys that you've definitely heard of, the guys that are at the center of the conflict here. If we have villains of World War II, it's certainly guys like Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. But who are the good guys? In some classes, we've talked about that need for heroes to rise up against those villains. And throughout World War II, we'll see if we can actually find people like that, and who they are, and where they're from, if they do exist. In some classes, we've even gotten as far as talking about how France and Britain responded to all of these conflicts and whether or not that was effective, the strategy of appeasement. And if we're not there, don't worry. In your class, if we're not there, we will talk about it in the coming days. But just so that you know, the idea of blitzkrieg, Hitler's use of a fast war to take over other territories, has already gone into effect by the time of which we're talking about today, when we pick up in the United States. So France and Britain have been effectively unable to stop Hitler and his advancement. He took Poland, and he also used that same tactic of lightning war to take out the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And he sets his eyes on France, trying to get revenge for the embarrassment that Germany experienced at the hands of the French at the end of World War I. So we pick up there, but we don't pick up in France and we don't pick up in Germany. Let's talk about where we are, the United States, in all of this. After all, this is a U.S. history course, so let's talk about the U.S. So America responds. Roosevelt found a way to connect and inform the public on important matters using the widely available and modern technology of the radio. If the year is 1939, then the radio has only been widely accessible to an American market for about 15 years by this time, and Roosevelt makes good use of it pretty much immediately. So, these ideas of fireside chats. World War II wasn't the first time Roosevelt used these fireside chats, but they became super popular, and they kind of became a cornerstone of his presidency due to the fear that was surrounding World War II. So, what were they? Roosevelt would sit before a microphone and just discuss with the American people what he thought concerning these issues that were plaguing the country at the time. When he started the fireside chats, the issue wasn't World War II, it was the Great Depression. And then when he came up with his strategies for the New Deal, he addressed them to the nation using these fireside chats, these informal radio broadcasts, where the president would come before his people and express his views. They weren't necessarily the entire government's views on these ideas. It was simply what the president thought should be done concerning these problems. So, he used them all the way throughout the Great Depression to express what he's trying to get done. And then when World War II came in, like I said, these things only grew in popularity. The fireside chats grew to be essential for the American people. They became a source of comfort. The first fireside chat that Roosevelt uses, the first one that he addresses the people with concerning World War II, is simply one that informs them about the start of the war. In the coming years, Roosevelt uses this format to speak out against Hitler and the Axis powers more directly. In that first one, it's simply a statement that World War II has begun. And he says it very somberly, very humbly before the people. But then in the coming fireside chats, he starts to get more aggressive. He starts to explain exactly what he thinks should be done in the war, exactly how much he can't stand the Axis powers, and Hitler in particular. In his fireside chat in 1940, he actually looks at Hitler, he talks about Hitler and the Nazi Party, and he says, "There is no reasoning with these people." Direct quoting this of Hitler, he says, "There is no reasoning with an incendiary bomb. We cannot negotiate with them. We will not negotiate with them." He expresses that the ideas of the Nazi Party and of these totalitarian rulers that are taking over Europe at the time, they are not cohesive with the United States. And so when I come back with you, we'll talk about some of the people who are trying to reason with and figure out what we should do concerning the world powers in Europe at the time. And some people believe that we should ally ourselves with the Axis powers because they are inevitably going to take over all of Europe. Well, those people didn't expect, first of all, Britain to put up as much of a fight as they did. And second of all, they weren't considering, as Roosevelt says, how impossible it is to rectify their government system with the ideals of American democracy. Roosevelt is very good at appealing to those core concepts of the American understanding of government, appealing to that and saying because of these fundamental truths, there's no way that we can reason with these people. They're an incendiary bomb, and a bomb explodes. You do not negotiate with it. Cool. By the way, at the end of all of these slides, I'll give some time for you to pause this video, and if you need to take some more time and finish writing down these notes, that's totally cool. I'll move on to the next thing, but please feel free to pause the video if anybody needs some more time to write down what's the notes that you need to take on this. Cool? Great. So as the Second World War broke out, the United States was completely divided on whether or not we should actually get involved in the conflict. And a lot of people holding to classic American traditions would promote isolationism yet again. That same thing that kept us out of the beginning of World War I is rearing its head again. The isolationists are strongly believing that the ocean that divides us from Europe is exactly what should keep us out of the conflict. As a matter of fact, it's Roosevelt himself that's appealing to the Monroe Doctrine. This idea that the United States stays out of European conflicts so long as Europe stays out of American conflicts, right? The problem is that it doesn't necessarily work in this modern day and age, and Roosevelt starts to recognize that as well, that while that ideal where we stay in our hemisphere and they stay in theirs is great and wonderful and should be the ideal, the fact of the matter is that the problems at hand, the issues at hand, and the threats to humanity itself at hand in World War II are too serious, too egregious to continue to ignore. So Roosevelt's going to push and push a lot against those isolationists. So he tries to reveal the dangers of American isolationism during World War II to both the public and to the rest of the government in his State of the Union address on January 6th of 1941. So in that speech, it becomes known as the Four Freedoms speech. In it, Roosevelt addresses and outlines the four freedoms that he considers to be fundamental to the United States as a country. So, freedoms that the United States ought to secure not just domestically, though, but as a foundation for all world government. If we are going to have an influence abroad, if we're going to promote American democracy, what should we promote with it? Well, Roosevelt's going to outline that very clearly and very concisely with these four freedoms. So, according to Roosevelt, these freedoms are also the antithesis of the dictatorial tyrants that we're seeing in Europe, which again is why we cannot find ourselves allying with Germany or Japan or Italy at this time, and certainly not Russia. So, what sets the United States apart from these other nations is the idea that freedom means the supremacy of human rights. When we talk about freedom in the United States in the modern day, Roosevelt's saying, when he talks about freedom as the President of the United States, the idea that he's appealing to is the supremacy of human rights. Above all else, we have to pursue and affirm the rights that God has gifted to Americans and to people across the world. Roosevelt says the United States government recognizes these rights that are granted not by man but by God, and that other countries have to recognize those rights as well. And it's the duty of the United States to help those other countries recognize that that's what's necessary, that's what's required of them as a benevolent government. All right, let's talk about the four freedoms. So now that I've brought this idea of the four freedoms up, what are they actually? The first two are going to sound very familiar to us. Roosevelt is appealing to some very good primary sources. He's ripping off some good people to rip off. It's the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution itself. The Bill of Rights itself appeals to these ideas. So the First Amendment to the Constitution itself. Freedom of speech and expression, and the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. The second set, the third and fourth freedoms, are a little bit modern. Roosevelt is taking the ideas of American democracy and he's pushing them in a bit of a new direction. So we've got two very old and tried and true ideas of American freedom, and then two newer ideas of American freedom that Roosevelt is arguing are modern and are new and are necessary in a ever-increasing globalized world. All right, so let's talk about them. Number one, freedom of speech and expression. It is an absolute human right to have a voice and to be able to use it. Roosevelt argues that absolutely every government that is being benevolent, that is acting with ethics towards its people, is going to grant them the ability to have a voice. Not necessarily a democratic voice in government. He's not going that far, though we probably wouldn't disagree with that. But what he's saying is that the government will not suppress the voice of its people, that it will hear them out if there's concerns, that they won't use their authority to shut down the people's ideas or their voice, right? Number two, the freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. Roosevelt aggressively appeals to religion throughout his entire presidency, especially when he's making arguments. He uses morality as the basis for a lot of his arguments. And as you might know, how can you make a moral argument? The best way to do it is to appeal to a higher moral authority than our own. We talked about it a little bit with modernism, the idea that Freud, with the superego, was addressing this idea of morality being baked into humanity itself. But even in his own psychology, if morality is based on each individual human, then each individual human has its own understandings of morality. So how do we reconcile the fact that all of us have moral guiding principles that are consistent with each other? Well, Roosevelt argues that it comes from God, and that because we have these guiding principles from God, because God has granted us the ability to understand morality and the ability to understand our own freedoms and the rights that we ought to have as people, that the people should then be free to worship God in their own way. So, freedom of religion, one of the core pillars that the United States was founded upon. Even as colonies, the American colonies were founded upon religious freedom. This has always been a land of religious opportunity, and Roosevelt is arguing that that idea benefits the entire world and every world government. So each nation must concede that religious practice is a human right and ought not be suppressed. Now let's talk about 3 and 4. First of which, freedom from want. This is very capitalistic. Let's talk about it. So, promotion of economic understanding that will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants. Baked into these words themselves are the understanding that we just got through the Great Depression, that it's clear on Roosevelt's mind and on the minds of the American people. Roosevelt is saying that in order to have a successful government, a government that serves its people well, the government has to have enough economic involvement and enough economic understanding to secure, in times of peace, a healthy lifestyle for its inhabitants. That the country should be economically successful enough for the people to enjoy the blessings of liberty during peace, right? Does that make sense? Again, Roosevelt is going off of the idea that we haven't been experiencing this. During the Great Depression, the United States was not experiencing this. So we need to do better. And not only that, but we need to start promoting this idea of successful economy and understanding government economy throughout the entire world. That governments need to start getting involved in their economic procedures, and they need to start not just getting involved, but being good at economy, right? Not just for the sake of taking over the economy and having more control and authority, but for the sake of the people themselves. That's the argument that Roosevelt is making here. And now with these ones, I'll give you some time once you finish writing this down. I want you to talk with people around you and see if you agree with this one and with the second one. Hopefully we're not in disagreement over the first two, though there's certainly a discussion on how we express our freedom of worship and whether or not we should be free to worship any God in any way, or if there's a right way and a wrong way to worship God. I'll let you discuss that for yourselves, and I'd love to enter into that conversation with you guys either tomorrow when I see you or at a later time where we get to reapproach this idea of religious practice, right? So finally, the fourth freedom from fear. This idea is probably the most controversial of the four. There's discussion surrounding all of them, but this one in particular is the biggest one. So, worldwide reduction of weapons to such a point that no nation will be in a position to commit any act of physical aggression against any of their neighbors. Basically, Roosevelt is saying it's international disarmament, right? That thing that even Wilson tried to do following World War I. Get everybody to lay down their weapons, get everybody to demilitarize to a point at which we wouldn't be in a place where we can attack our neighbors. The United States would not have enough gunpowder to go to war with Canada if we wanted to, even though we want to. No. But also the idea that especially Europe, which is war-torn as it is, and is naturally a little bit more territorial and desiring to expand, right? Not just on their continent, but also in Africa. The idea that they would lay down their weapons, that they would demilitarize to a point at which their neighbors are comfortable living next to them, right? And this discussion is still up for debate today. So when we ask, can we achieve these freedoms, these ideas that Roosevelt has, these are not just historical arguments. They're still being asked today. We are still asking the question, is it safer for everyone to demilitarize than it is for everybody to be ready to go to war? And already you might hear the parallels or the contrast between this and the big stick diplomacy idea, right? Reminder that FDR's own relative, Teddy Roosevelt, made the argument that peace is best achieved by having a strong military to back you up. Now, this is kind of the antithesis of that. Well, we should probably start to pursue peace and freedom by making sure that we aren't fearful of our neighbors that have a big stick that will swing it if we avoid peace. What Roosevelt is saying is not everybody who has the military to support themselves is going to use it wisely or prudently. They're not going to use it to establish or promote or proliferate peace. They're going to use it to proliferate conflict. And you see that case in point with Hitler, right? Hitler remilitarizes Germany and breaks the Treaty of Versailles by doing so, but he doesn't care, right? He keeps building up that military at the expense of Austria, at the expense of Czechoslovakia and Poland, and very many other countries that we've already talked about after that, right? To the point at which Hitler has practically taken over every significant country aside in Europe, aside from Britain, right? And Russia. And all of those states that Russia takes over as well. But the point being that these big governments, and Russia included as well, Russia expands their territory in World War II using an aggressive military tactic. The point being that not every country that has that strong military presence is going to use it to promote peace. A lot of times, militaries are used to wage war, if you can believe that. All right, so take some time if you need to still copy this down. Take some time to do that. Once you're done, pause this video for a second and chat with one or two people around you. Just discuss those ideas that are highlighted over there. Do you agree with these freedoms? Are they practical? And have we or can we achieve these goals? Cool. Take a little bit of time and talk with the people around you. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about today with you guys are some of the acts of Congress that were passed. I know, it's your favorite part of class. We get to talk about the legislation that happened in the 1940s, or leading right up to the conflict of the 1940s. So let's talk about what Congress was doing in response to this conflict in Europe. So when all the conflict started breaking out in Europe, Congress passed what they called neutrality acts, which made laws that would prevent the United States from being forced to get involved in another European conflict by sticking firmly to isolationism. These laws quite literally address the exact issues that caused us to get involved with World War I in the first place, literally directly. One of the laws in the Neutrality Act forbids Americans to travel on British passenger ships during times of war. It could not be more clear that they wanted to avoid the issue that happened on the Lusitania and the Sussex, right? When the German U-boats sunk those vessels and Americans were on board, it caused problems for us because a lot of people thought, hey, we should declare war on Germany. They just killed about 300 of our people. So Congress wanted to avoid those issues from happening again, and they passed the Neutrality Acts. In 1935, 36, and 37, they passed different Neutrality Acts. And then in 1939, they passed what I'll call a Neutrality Act, definitely with the air quotes in mind. This one changed a lot by request from Roosevelt himself. So let's talk about it. The Neutrality Act of 1939 changes in a big way. It maintained the U.S. neutrality, at least outwardly, but also included what we called a cash and carry provision. Again, that was requested directly by Roosevelt, who was making it clear by 1939 that he wasn't really on board with neutrality. He wasn't on board with isolationism. He knew exactly how anti-Nazi, how anti-Axis powers he was going to be as a president, and so he starts to push Congress to feel the same way. They don't get on board just yet, but they do give him a little bit of wiggle room, and he'll take that and run with it. So, what does Roosevelt request? It's this cash and carry provision. Using this provision, the United States is allowed to sell goods to nations at war if they can get to the United States, pay cash for the product, and transport it back to their own country by their own means. Essentially, yeah, we'll sell you the goods, but you have to get to the United States. You have to get to our shores in order to pick up the product yourself, and you have to be able to safely transport it back to your own country. So I ask you, who is the only country that is going to be able to do that safely and confidently? Who controls the seas? They've been doing it since World War I and far before that. It's Britain. The Neutrality Act of 1939 and the cash and carry provision involved in it only benefits Britain. This was a kind of covert way for the United States to show their support for and financially support the Allied powers. Because Britain controls the seas, this act only helps the Allied powers and definitely isn't truly neutral. But that's by design. We're starting to reveal our hand a little bit. As the chips fall and as the conflict arises more and more, and as we lead closer and closer to world war, the United States government is starting to realize that there's only one way that we can truly fall in this conflict. We will not side with the Axis powers, and we probably won't even end up staying neutral. We are going to have to back the Allied powers. That is our option. And so Roosevelt will say doing so is the only answer for Americans. In one of his fireside chats, he'll say that we are the artillery of democracy. We must arm the people who are promoting world democracy. We have a responsibility to do that. Again, he's speaking from opinion in those fireside chats, but that opinion starts to fester in Americans, and we start to realize how right that opinion probably is. At least, it's definitely true that we cannot find ourselves siding with the Axis powers. And there is a good case for isolationism. As a matter of fact, there is an isolationist movement that is pleading with every fiber of their being for Roosevelt to pursue neutrality. And remember that guy Charles Lindbergh? He's the foremost speaker in that movement. Lindbergh, one of the prominent American celebrities at the time, is pleading with Roosevelt not to get involved in this conflict. And yet Roosevelt, as well as an increasing number of Americans, is going to start to realize that neutrality isn't really an option. We only have one course of action, and it is to start rooting out the dictatorships that are taking over Europe. Start supporting Britain as they start to become the last hope for the Allied powers in this war. So what should we do to support Britain in World War II? Without directly getting involved in the war ourselves, how do we support the Allied powers? Well, in 1941, in that same address to Congress on January 6th, Roosevelt's going to push even further, demanding Congress to allow the U.S. to loan money and military provisions to Britain. Not just sell them, but to loan out that money, to loan the provisions to them. He puts it this way. To Congress, he says this: what would happen if your neighbor's house was on fire? If your neighbor's house was on fire, would you sell them a hose? No, you would give them one. You would give them a hose. Why? Well, because giving them a hose and allowing them to put out their fire makes you a good neighbor. But not only that, it also prevents the fire from spreading to your house as well. So it benefits your neighbor, also makes you good at being a neighbor, just a decent human being. And at the same time, it also helps you, because eventually that fire is going to spread to your house if you don't address it. If you don't help out your neighbor, you're going to eventually have to deal with that problem. Can you see the connection to World War II here? Roosevelt is saying, Germany, the Axis powers, are a fire that absolutely must be put out. Right now, our neighbor across the sea, Britain, is the one that has to deal with putting out this fire. Are we going to continue selling them hoses? No. We ought to offer them hoses. We ought to offer them our support in order to put out this fire, lest their house burn down, lest Britain fall to Germany, and lest we have to deal with Germany ourselves. Because eventually, Roosevelt says we're fools if we believe that the sea separating us from Europe is going to stop Germany from eventually setting its eyes on us, trying to take over the United States. We are fools if we believe that Germany wouldn't do that, because they would. They've already proven that they're willing to take over countries that didn't expect to get attacked or invaded by Germany. And so, Roosevelt is going to encourage, and Congress is going to pass, the Lend-Lease Act. Passed in March of 1941, this allowed the president to sell or lend supplies to any country whose defense he considered vital to the safety of the United States. So the president has the ultimate authority to decide to lend out war supplies to any country he deems fit. Well, if you had to guess, which side of the conflict is Roosevelt going to offer supplies to? It's going to be the Allied powers, right? Yes. So, we consider the Allied powers vital to the safety of the United States on the basis that they are the bastions of democracy in a world that is continuously turning into dictatorship after dictatorship. Totalitarian rule is on the rise, and Britain is trying to fend off all of those attacks, that onslaught, and they need help. So we're going to offer that help. But as you might understand, this pushes us closer and closer to the brink of war ourselves. We can't deny that the Lend-Lease Act is essentially an economic declaration of war against the Axis powers, and Germany in particular, right? You can see this. We are offering money and supplies to the Allied powers. While we're not fighting in the war, we're offering war supplies and we're offering finance to the Allied powers. So it's only a matter of time before we do get our hands dirty and get directly involved in this war. But it's not going to be our choice when that happens. No, Germany and the Axis powers are going to decide to retaliate against us. And in December of 1941, we see that retaliation hit U.S. soil directly. We didn't expect it, but that's when it came. A day that lives in infamy. But that is literally a story for another time. One that I absolutely have to talk about with you in person. So I will save that for when I'm with you guys in person. I'm very excited to talk about this topic with you. I hope you're excited to keep diving into it with me. I'll give you some more time to copy down these slides. Once you guys finish up with these slides, if you do still have time in class, I'd like you to take a look through sections 7.1 and 7.2 of your textbook. There are some key terms and definitions that we've gotten to, even in this presentation or in previous presentations. You should have some of those notes already. But there are other key terms and key figures that you don't have in your notes yet. So, for the rest of class, I'd like you to take a look through those sections. Make sure you have those people and those terms written down because they will be valid information for your upcoming test. All right? So, look through those sections of your textbook. Make sure you have those names and those people and those ideas written down, and then you should be good to go. One final reminder that you do have a quiz tomorrow. Hopefully you're ready for it. I look forward to seeing you then. I look forward to being back in person with all of you then. Thanks so much. See you tomorrow.